Hello, healthy people, and welcome back to Organelle. Today, the crucial difference between chronic and acute inflammation, the most effective anti-inflammation nutrition habits, whether physical therapies are effective at fighting inflammation, and the surprising effects of protein overconsumption. As always, I'm Xavier Greenhalgh, and joining me will be none other than the Organelle digital health platform's leading practitioner, Lionel Godwin. So, without further ado, let's all take the next best step on our health journeys. Lionel, one of your favorite topics today, something we've alluded to on a number of previous episodes, inflammation. Are you excited, my man?
I am excited for information because it's misunderstood information on so many different levels, and I'm keen to talk about it to let people one be aware of what inflammation does and why it can be both good and bad for us, but also what we can do around controlling inflammation as well.
Yeah, a lot of the topics we previously talked about are things that people already kind of understand or have a general idea of what it is. But inflammation, I feel, is just a huge black box for most people. They hear it and they're like, "What's that? Is that's what happens when you sprain your ankle?" Question mark. It was like when a bruise swells up. But you know, and I know to some degree that that's not quite the gist of it, and that inflammation actually plays a vital role in our nutrition and our organ systems and even our brain. So, Lionel, take it away for us with just a brief top level definition. What is inflammation and why is it important?
Oh, inflammation. Oh, very good. One of my favorite topics. Okay. So we have two types of inflammation generally. So we're talking about acute inflammation and we're talking about chronic inflammation. They do two significantly different things within the body. So let's just we'll give a broad definition of inflammation, and then we'll talk about the nuances of both. So inflammation, when we refer to inflammation in the body, we're talking about the body's natural response to either injury, infection, or tissue damage. All right, it's a complex biological process involving various immune cells, chemicals, and blood vessels within the body. When inflammation occurs, the immune system activates to protect the body, really, and that's what it's about. It's an initiating a healing process, and it can help in the short term, and that's what we refer to as acute inflammation. Then we have chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation. We'll take a step back. Common signs of acute inflammation, a bit like you referred to earlier when you were mistaking nutrition for inflammation. We can get redness or bruising or swelling or heat and pain, and that's where we get acute inflammation, and that's just the body's natural healing processes taking place. The bad inflammation is the chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is inflammation that is remains in the body. It's not there just because we've had a bit of a trauma or an injury or a virus or an illness. It's inflammation that's built up within our body. And this long-term chronic inflammation is what can really lead to nearly all the non-communicable diseases that we get in the body. So your cancers, your uh, mental health issues, your Alzheimer's, all of these things can all be put down to long-term chronic inflammation, heart disease. You know, there's so many uh, things that get impacted by chronic inflammation. Arthritis is another classic example of chronic inflammation. Autoimmune disorders, again, these all come from chronic inflammation. So, chronic inflammation is something that we really need to manage and get on top of. Never be frightened of acute inflammation, obviously, because that's helping us in the short term. But chronic inflammation is really detrimental to our long term health and mortality.
Yeah, so just to explain to the listener and to myself, because I'm not really sure, what are some of the sources of chronic inflammation? How does one find themselves chronically inflamed?
Uh, Poor diet, poor sleep, alcohol abuse, excess smoking, poor environments, stress and anxiety, one of the biggest contributors to inflammation in the body. So, you know, all of the things that we can control. Nutrition, number one. Stress and anxiety, number two. The environment in which we live is really, really, really important. You managing how we deal with day-to-day situations, limiting our exposure to heavy metals and toxins and the like. These can all reduce our exposure to or the likelihood of developing chronic inflammation within the body. There's a for people that are really interested, and I'll just digress for a minute, one of my favourite authors on the subject of inflammation is Professor Paul Clayton. If anybody ever gets the chance to ever buy any of his books, Professor Paul Clayton is he was a pharmacologist who uh, graduated summa cum laude from Edinburgh University, and was well renowned in the pharmacological industry. But he's come right over the other side to the nutritional side, and he's made inflammation his life's work effectively. And he's written some very, very, very good books on dealing with and understanding chronic inflammation. So just for our listeners out there, if they ever want to get some really good information on it, Professor Paul Clayton, is an ideal reference point for us.
Hmm, Roger that. So we've briefly touched off that there are some inputs that will create inflammation in the body: poor sleep, stress, bad nutrition. Why do those things create inflammation in the body? It's like what's happening
Um,
in our bodies creating
So
those things.
what's happening within the body is that we're getting what we call lot of oxidative stress. So you hear about free radicals. You hear the term free radical all of the time. Free radicals are these things that attack the molecules that make up our cells. So that means that when these free radicals are destroying the molecules that are trying to come together to make up our cells, it's almost like you can imagine rust in a car. These things are causing rust in our cells, and this creates a hell of a lot of inflammation within our cells. And when our cells are inflamed, the wall of the cell, so if you can imagine this was a cell, the wall of the cell itself becomes very rigid. And once that cell wall loses its flexibility and becomes very rigid, it's really hard for inflammation to pass into that cell. And then by the time the information does pass into the cell, it stays in the cell longer than what it should before it exits the cell. And all the time that it's in there, it's increasing this toxicity and this inflammation within that cell, which means the efficiency of that cell is then really, really compromised. And the cell then is not working to its optimum. So it's not working at 100%. And the problem we have when that cell is not working at 100% is that that cell divides, and when that cell divides, it divides almost in a mirror image of itself. So it's being damaged, and it's then being replicating itself as a damaged cell rather than as a whole cell. Now, if we try and fight that by understanding that we need to have a lot more antioxidant rich foods in our diet, those antioxidant rich foods will stop that oxidation occurring. So it'll stop those attacks on those molecules. Then those molecules will then allow the cells to form properly. They'll provide the flexibility back in the cell membrane so that information can go into the cell more easily and then be extricated from the cell just as easily. And we're removing all of that oxidative stress. So that's, in our nutrition, we're always talking about having a really broad cross section of foods, a really balanced diet. This particularly relates to antioxidants. We should have as high antioxidant rich foods as we can to deal with inflammation. It really makes the most significant difference that we can make into our overall health and our cell well-being is to have as many antioxidants in our foods as possible to deal with this chronic inflammation. As I said, if we don't, cancers increase, mental health declines, arthritis increases, cardiovascular disease increases, organal damage increases. So all of these manifestations are really damaging our health and our well-being.
Well, that's terrifying.
It
So,
is.
what are these antioxidant rich foods? What should we be eating?
Oh, so we as many vitamin-rich and mineral-rich foods as we can. So, good fibers, good fruits, good vegetables. Good herbs and spices. Herbs and spices are one of the greatest sources of powerful antioxidants. Now, I was very fortunate to grow up in a very multicultural environment where herbs and spices were in abundance in virtually every food that we ever ate. So I've always had an absolute plethora of very antioxidant rich herbs and spices in my foods. But all of our vegetables, all of our uh, salads, all of our fruits are all very, very high in antioxidants rich foods properties.
Are there some higher than others? I know like blueberries are thrown around as being really antioxidant rich.
They
Are
are.
there like specific superfoods we can really focus on?
Yeah, there are. There are a number of superfoods out there that will people refer to. Cacao being one, hemp seeds being another, spirulina being another, maca powder being another, turmeric, obviously one of the most obvious ones that people are aware of, ginger, garlic, pepper, chilies, um, rosemary, dill, marjoram, oregano, cinnamon, one of the great ones, even vanilla pods, fresh raw vanilla, cardamom. There's literally thousands of them. Any herbs and spices, any of the vegetables, any of the salads, seasonal fruits in particular and vegetables in particular are much higher in antioxidant rich properties. So really, how long's a piece of string when it comes to being able to access all of these antioxidants. There are literally thousands of them out there. It's a matter of one, adapting your taste uh, buds to a lot of them, or finding ways of incorporating them into your day-to-day routine of your food preparation. And it's a very simple thing to do. I'll give you an example for instance, how I try and get as many antioxidants into my foods. If I'm cooking a grain, whether it be a quinoa or a couscous or a black rice or a brown rice, and if I'm using the absorption method, I'll include in the water as I'm about to cook my rice or my grains, I'll add half a dozen spices into the water so that they're being absorbed by the absorption method of cooking into the grains that I'm preparing for a meal. And for me, that's a really easy way of doing it. If I'm having a smoothie, for instance, I'll add ginger into my smoothie. I'll add cacao powder into my smoothie. I'll add um, um, spirulina into my powder. I'll add hemp seed into my powder, and I'll add cinnamon into my smoothie. Sorry, not my powder. I'll add these into my smoothie. Again, just to make sure that I'm getting this abundance of antioxidant rich foods, apart from the other foods that I'm putting into my smoothies. Again, soups another way. Cooking soups and adding all of the nutrients into the soups and all of the herbs and spices into the soups. Adding all of the vegetables into a soup is a really good way to get an abundance of these really antioxidant rich, inflammation lowering properties into our foods.
Right, so we've got there that an important way to try and fix inflammation in the body is massively increasing your antioxidant intake. And obviously, another important thing to do is to remove the sources of inflammation in the first place, but each of those kind of has its own episode here, so we won't focus too much on that. Are there other ways we can directly combat inflammation? I'm thinking there physical therapy routes, cold exposure, maybe massages. Are there ways other
Oh,
than just upping
absolutely.
antioxidants?
Yeah, anytime that we can remove toxicity from our body, that's a real positive. Exercise is obviously a great way. Um, Massage is very, very good. Um, you know, a lot of different massage therapies and massaging techniques, lymph node drainage and those sorts of things are very, very good at removing these sort of toxicities from the body. Obviously, we want to also maintain a healthy weight is really one of the easiest ways. If you can maintain a really healthy weight, obviously you want to avoid smoking at all costs. You want to limit alcohol consumption. You want to practice good hygiene as well, because these a lot of these inflammation in the body can come through pathogens and viruses and bacteria and stuff as well. So, practicing really good hygiene, these are all ways that we can, in a behavioral sense, that we can do it. As I said, lymphatic drainage is, one of the really proven ways of being able to remove toxicities and inflammation from the body. There's lots of alternative treatments out there.
Lymphatic drainage? Sounds like a
Mm,
torture method. What's
It
that?
is, and it can be painful for some people when you drain the lymph nodes, and it's something that should always be done by a professional in that area. And it's just all it's doing. It's cleaning out all of the lymph nodes in the body and removing that toxicity and that buildup of toxins within the body. And again, it should always be done by someone who's highly trained and is skilled in the art of it.
Well, okay. I want to end us off on something that's kind of contentious between us, mainly just because you're an expert and I just don't want to accept your opinion here. But let's talk about too much protein being inflammatory for the body, specifically around too much meat protein. Could you walk us through that, Lionel?
Yes. Oh, look, we overconsume protein. We, well, not as a society. That's poor use of word. People in the health in gyms and athletes have been seduced by believing that we need to overconsume protein, and protein and the digestion of protein can create a lot of toxicity within the body because we generally are underhydrated. We don't eat or drink enough fluid to help with protein metabolism, and that can provide a lot of toxicity in the body when the body's trying to break down excess protein, particularly for our kidneys. It can be really dangerous for our kidneys if we've got excess protein. And when our kidneys aren't able to function properly, that can increase the level of toxicity, hence, uh, therefore, inflammation within the body as well. So it's really important that, when we're eating protein, that we have protein that one is not overcooked, because that's one of the biggest problems that we have with a lot of our protein consumption. As Australians, we generally overcook our meat. When we overcook our meat, we really tighten the fibers in our meat. And the tighter those fibers are, the longer it takes for our body to break them down. And I'm not a person who, the thought of having rotting, decaying flesh because it's been overcooked sitting in my colon and bowel for up to 36 hours is really, really off putting, because all I've then has got this decaying, rotting flesh sitting in my colon and my bowel, which is creating its own form of toxicity. And so I'm very conscious of not, one, overcooking meat, and two, over consuming meat. I try and have uh, better forms of protein, to try forms of protein that are much easier to break down, for instance. And for me, that comes in the way of our grains, certainly our beans and our legumes and our lentils and things like that. It's much easier to break down the cellular integrity of these foods and therefore absorb the nutrients from those without them taking as long to break down as overcooked meat, for instance.
And the general rule, I think, is roughly a gram of protein per pound of body weight, which for
Yeah,
someone like me would probably be about 180 grams of protein a day. Or
yeah.
what would you say that should be instead?
Um, Look, it depends obviously on your muscle mass, how much resistance training you're doing. I operate myself for I probably halve that for myself, but I also monitor my protein levels. I monitor it through uh, my blood works, and I also do it through my body composition machine that I have, which monitors the amount of protein in my body. I for me, it's about much more about the net usable protein that we eat, as opposed to the amount of protein that we eat. So, if we've got a cleaner source of protein, generally the net usable amount of that protein we can use in the body much more efficiently. For me, if I'm going to have a 200-gram steak, the net usable protein in there is probably only 30% of the value of the weight of that steak. So you also got to understand that it takes quite some time for our bodies, in a digestive sense, to break down the proteins, particularly from meats. It takes a lot longer to try and break that down So a lot of that protein is virtually going through unabsorbed anyway. So I try and use higher net usable proteins. Um, and for me, that just means I'm getting much more efficient absorption of my protein, and I'm not having to eat anywhere near as much.
So, pardon the slight technical difficulty there, but Lionel, that's a fantastic overview of the basic. That's a fantastic overview of inflammation and how it works with our body. Would you say so?
Yeah, I hope it was, and I hope people understood it. I tend to waffle once I get going on some of these subjects, but yeah,
That's
my
what we love. I'm sure we'll speak more about in future, but for now, that's it. Thank you for your time, Lionel.
thank you, David. Good to see you again.